So this presentation is going to look at the institutions of national decision-making, how governments are structured. This is probably the oldest sort of approach in political science, to look at government, to understand it, to figure out why it's structured the way it is and how those structures influence the outcome. The study of institutions include the formal institutions, legislative, executive, judicial, bureaucratic, the legal system, but also it looks at the informal ones. We're going to stay on the formal ones in this presentation, but it also includes intermediaries such as the mass media, such as public opinion, such as interest groups, and of course political parties. For those of you who don't know, I know Americans tend to think parties are bad, but the reality is you can't really have a democracy without political parties, and that's the topic for a political parties course, not this one. So again, there's this focus on both formal and informal institutions. There's sort of an emphasis on the process by which laws are made, and then also the extent to which the institutions of government either promote or limit democracy, and often that's a very, very intentional design. The first type is parliamentary system. Parliamentary system is sort of the most common in the world, and it's the one you may be familiar with, where there is no separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch like there is in the United States. The prime minister, the leader of the country, the head of state as it's often called, is a member of parliament, elected into parliament. All of the cabinet ministers are also members of parliament, and so the executive functions that we separate in the United States system are combined in a parliamentary system. There are three types of ways that members of the parliament are elected, three general systems as they're called. There's first past the post, where you divide the number of seats by geographic constituency, and whoever gets more votes than anybody else in a given election in that constituency represents the geographic constituency. You can get 30% of the vote, and if there are 8, 9, 10, 12 more candidates who get fewer votes than you do, you still get elected. So there's no guarantee that majority will prevail. The second type is a proportional representation system, and proportional representation is exactly what it sounds like, that the representation of a political party is usually in proportion to the percentage of the vote that they get. And it's usually the national percentage, but in some places they localize that percentage, and there's a mix. It's very complex. Everybody does it a little differently. But again, the proportion of the vote corresponds to the proportion of seats that you get. So if you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats, roughly speaking. The third I just want to mention because it's considered to be the fairest and the most democratic in terms of giving people voices, but not just one voice, but multiple voices in an election. And it's called the single transferable vote. The single transferable vote, which takes forever to actually count the votes, is where on election day one would go in, a voter would go in and vote for their first choice, and then they have the option of choosing a second choice and then a third choice, and sometimes even fourth and fifth and sixth choices. And what happens is when they go and tally the vote, there's usually a threshold requirement somewhere around 15 to 20%, and if your party doesn't get 15 to 20% of the vote, you have to you basically get knocked out. And they go and they vote. They look at all the people who voted for you as their first choice and see who their second choice is and count that vote. And they repeat the process over and over until they have all the votes counted all the times, and then they proportionally allocate. So it prevents too many smaller parties from getting into parliament, but it does provide for a wider array and more voice for any given individual. Another important element of parliamentary system is the importance of cabinet ministers or secretaries. These are also people who are elected usually from the majority or the majority coalition, and they are members of parliament who have executive functions of implementing the laws passed by parliament. It allows for more symmetry, more speediness of change, and so there's a lot of sort of activity that goes on, and it makes for clear changes in policy whenever those changes are warranted by elections. Parliamentary systems usually have a maximum term of office In Great Britain, for example, it's 5 years. There has to be an election at least once every 5 years, but that those elections aren't fixed, meaning there could be an election at 3 years or 2 years or 1 year or 3 months. And Italy was famous for having elections every several months because they've had more than 50 governments in the past 50 years because they couldn't, keep, the majority coalition couldn't keep confidence. And so when there's a no confidence vote, there's an election. And sometimes prime ministers call for elections when their party is doing very well, like the Conservatives did recently in Great Britain, called an earlier election because it looked like they might actually win, and they did. So the advantages of a parliamentary system over the next type, well, the most important, accountability and responsiveness. That government, who's responsible for the policies and the implementation of those policies. And if you like them, you reward them. If you don't like them, you punish them. It tends to be very party-oriented rather than individually oriented. And that means it's very clear who's doing the work and who's responsible for it. As a result, party systems and parliamentary systems tend to be very responsive to what they perceive to be the public will. The disadvantages are, well, there's a possibility for instability. If it's a close or a divided country in a close election, coalitions are kind of complex. You have left and right wing parties in the coalition, which does happen all the time. You might get instability. There might be the inability to get a vote of confidence, in a very short period of time. There can also be huge policy swings if a new party takes over, and so there's almost this jarring sense that government can change radically very quickly. That's both an advantage and disadvantage. The second type of system, which is the one we have here in the U.S. and other places, a few other places, is where the president or the chief executive is elected separately from the legislative body, can't serve in the legislature, and is the only one with a truly national constituency, meaning the people of the country are sort of the constituents of this chief executive, whereas in the legislative body, it's usually a geographic constituency. The chief executive function, the chief executive, is responsible for overseeing government operations, and so the president in this country is technically the head of the bureaucracy and has a number of people at the top layers of each bureaucratic agency trying to get the career civil servants to implement policy in a way that may actually enhance, promote, or create presidential agenda. And if you saw President Obama sort of getting smacked back by the Supreme Court on immigration policy, well, that's an example of the president sort of having the ability to try to sort of sway government to behave in a particular way by themselves. The president has that ability. It's not quite as strong as they often think it is. Power in these types of systems tend to be fragmented on purpose in the United States and other places as well. Policy is much harder to achieve than in parliamentary systems because there is no responsiveness mechanism, because you may have a president of the Democratic Party like we do now and Republicans controlling both chambers of Congress like we do now. They have very strong principles that are opposed to each other frequently, and as a result there's stalemate. And again, in the instance of the framers of our Constitution, they purposely did that. They realized very quickly how problematic that was, and that's why we developed political parties to create that bridge so that the President and Congress could work together. We've recently, by the way, seen the destruction of that bridge with the rise of this individualistic consciousness about politics, which is why we have 16 Republicans running for president. If we had strong parties, they wouldn't be doing that, because party leaders would say no to probably 13 of them or 12 of them, and they would have that right. The other, there are questions about accountability and responsiveness. If we don't like what the country is doing, who do we blame? Do we blame Obama? Do we blame Boehner? Do we blame Mitch McConnell? Do we blame them all? Do we blame none of them? And so that one of the problems of a presidential system, particularly like ours, is everybody can point the finger at someone else. In addition, because there's often divided government these days, in large part because of our tendency to think parties are bad and that individuals are what we should focus on when we vote, which is stupid, by the way, and I can explain to you why. And I say stupid on purpose to be provocative, so I apologize if I offended you. But again, you can't have a responsive government if nobody can get anything done alone and they all disagree and they're there because we all put them there. And so, you know, presidential systems are harder to actually get things done and harder for citizens to know who to credit and blame. There are also challenges related to midterm elections, meaning elections when the chief executive is not standing for re-election every 4 years. In the off-year election in the United States, we see a phenomenon where the president I'm going to continue that, where the president often loses seats from his own party or her own party because voters are usually not too happy, or because a lot of people who voted for that person don't show up in the midterm. The third type, I just wanted to sort of quickly go through this, are what are called non-democratic systems. These are usually ruled by one person or a small group of people. Sometimes they call themselves presidents, sometimes they're a monarch, sometimes they're the chairman, and I put dear leader for the dear departed leader of Korea, and his son now is, I forget exactly what they call him now, but it's something like that. I'll get that and maybe I'll repeat it next presentation. Their government tends to be very centralized. They have internal politics within the central command. Back when I was your age, or when I was in my late teens and early 20s, there was this approach to understanding Soviet Union called Kremlinology, trying to figure out who's working in the Kremlin with you know, the Soviet leader, and what kind of changes there may be, who stands next to the important people at important events. There's often a discussion of how important these sort of shadows of power might be, meaning, you know, if there's somebody who used to stand next to the premier all the time and now they're gone, that's usually an indication something happened. That's how you kind of focus on these governments, the internal stuff. It's actually very difficult to know. There's usually a legislative body in non-democratic systems, but it's usually a rubber stamp. Whether that rubber stamp is sort of an official rubber stamp or a de facto, meaning in practice rubber stamp, they're there, but they don't normally challenge the person in charge. They're often accompanied by authoritarian social structures of control as well. They're the local council in China. In China, sort of they decentralize sort of the spying that goes on of anybody, and so, you know, you have to look out for what the local council members are seeing, and they're always looking around for people not doing what they're supposed to. There are ministers in Saudi Arabia. There are national councils in fascist systems, which sometimes include business leaders. Often in fascist systems, the business leadership works very closely, directly with the military and with the governmental power structure. And so, you know, they're often accompanied, these types of systems are often also authoritarian, sometimes totalitarian, meaning they control everything. I want to give you an example of Iran as a mixed government where there's some elected institutions. There's a parliament, it's a parliamentary system, but that elected sort of body does not necessarily control everything. And so if you see on the left hand, there are elected institutions. Citizens basically vote for parliament. Parliament creates the cabinet. Now you notice the president also has a role in the cabinet, but the president is created by an assembly of experts. These experts actually come from the unelected institution. You have the supreme leader, the Ayatollah usually. You have the leaders of the armed forces. You have the head of the judiciary, who's usually somebody selected by or supported by the supreme leader. And then there's something in Iran called an expedience council. And you know, those are unelected people who create this assembly of experts. The assembly of experts select the president in part as a result of elections. And then you see what's called the Guardian Council. Parliament has a role in selecting some of the Guardian Council, but the supreme leader and the head of the judiciary appoint, I believe, a majority of them. And as a result, that Guardian Council actually has an enormous amount of informal power to issue edicts. And so some systems like Iran are mixed, and if you want to read more about it, I have the link down there. You can go to the BBC or just type in Iran government explained. That's how I got it, and you should be able to sort of figure it out. You notice that red dotted line, the Guardian Council can actually say no to someone who wants to run for parliament. Okay. So the role of law and the courts in a political system. The role of law and courts is a very important one, and this is part of the reason why I decided to do this presentation, is to get you to start thinking about law and courts and their role so that we can then go and look at same-sex marriage. The rule of law is a term used to describe preserving sort of institutional order of government and protecting the liberties and rights of individual citizens as well as groups. And so courts are often seen as the main sort of maintainer, or the primary maintainer, of the rule of law. And in other words, they protect both the system and sometimes the individuals in the system. There are 4 types of law. There's criminal law. Law is a violation against the criminal code, which means you have conducted an offense against not just the person who is the victim, but the state itself. So criminal law carries with it penalties that are usually related to imprisonment, or sometimes worse, as we'll see in a minute. There's civil law. Civil law is actually a private disagreement between 2 parties that are not the state. One of them can be the state sometimes, but it's usually often called a tort, where somebody feels that someone else violated a contract or the proper way of conducting their affairs, and so they sue in civil court. Third is constitutional, and that's defining the confines and the meaning of words that were codified when constitutions were written or revised. And then finally, again, one of the themes of this course is this whole idea of the nation state is changing. Well, international law, since World War II particularly, has become a very, very important type of law that we study, and that is things like human rights law, international criminal, the International Criminal Court, the Court of Justice. I mean, there are all sorts of international codes of law now that we agree to enter into, and now to some degree have some enforcement over various portions of it. There are 3 approaches to law. The one that we're most familiar with is the Anglo-Saxon law, which is a case or common law approach. And that's where in Anglo-Saxon or case or common law approaches, you have the judiciary acting as a referee. It's essentially a disinterested party whose job is to help resolve the conflict that comes before them. And so when a case comes before them, they have to determine sort of what the fair outcome should be. And they are not partial to any party. They're supposed to be impartial, which means that if somebody is suing the government, like they did recently in the same-sex marriage case, the role of the court there is to act as a disinterested party to figure out what the proper resolution is. And if that means government has to change, so be it. If it means that government gets sort of what it wants, so be it. That's a very different type of law. The United States and Great Britain use that approach, and other, Canada does too, to some degree. But the more dominant type of law in the world is continental, or what is often called code law. Those of you who are familiar with canon law, which is the law of the Roman Catholic Church, canon law is essentially a form of continental code law. The judiciary in continental law is actually an advocate for the government's policy. So it tends to take an advocacy position for government, and it resolves disputes and it makes determinations, but there's no impartiality assumed or desired. And so in a criminal case, for example, in Anglo-Saxon law, the judge has a very, very sort of passive role, and then when there's a question as to whether something was proper, they get to rule. In continental law, judges are very active and often are the ones who determine the outcome. And so it's very, very different. They're actually deeply involved, and their goal is to find what's in the best interest of the state. Very different. Religious law, excuse me. Religious law is where the judiciary enforces the obligations to the higher power involved, whether it's Allah in Sharia law or to God in sort of the sort of older forms of law of Europe, particularly sort of the Middle Ages and even the Renaissance period. The job of law was to enforce obligations to a higher power. And so if you look in Spain during the period of the Inquisitions, for example, the trials were held and conducted with priests, Dominican priests by the way, often presiding, making the determination and then handing people over to civil authorities as necessary to be converted or punished or sanctioned or expelled or acquitted even. But again, you know, Sharia law is what we're most familiar with. But again, this is the type of law that you see in many different areas where the job is to enforce the truth, capital T truth, absolute truth of God. So those are three approaches. Anglo-Saxon is sort of, again, the Anglo world. Continental, often the French are the sort of leaders in that, but it's more than just the French. And if you paid attention to the trial in Italy of the American accused of killing sort of her roommate during a weird sex encounter, you know, it's kind of confusing. Amanda Knox is her name, that's right. It's kind of confusing to those of us from the US because we're so used to the Anglo-Saxon law and not the Italian version of the law, where the goal is to find the outcome that's in the best interest of the state.